Kia ora, I'm Simon Jenga and welcome to Simon Says. Last week I sat down with Carlo Ellis, Strategic Māori Engagement Manager with Tauranga City Council, to discuss the Treaty of Waitangi and its principles. It seems to be getting harder and harder to talk about difficult topics in today's world. And this conversation was an off-the-cuff chat about the difficult issues surrounding the treaty. It's certainly not intended to be a comprehensive or complete picture, and Carlo and I don't pretend to be experts in everything that we discussed. That said, I hope that you enjoy the conversation that we had and that it sparks similar conversations in your own circles. Today, Simon says, keep an open mind, challenge your opinions, and remember, at LOA Law, we are good lawyers for good people. Enjoy. The purpose of this chat, and when we talked about it previously, is just to sit down and have, as you say, a kōrero about the treaty, the principles, how it fits into the modern world, whether we can solve the world's problems here today, this evening, or just chat it through, really. But you've got kind of, obviously, your personal background of your local iwi connections, which are to...
So affiliated to all of the iwi of Tauranga Moana, and there's 3 iwi here, so Ngaitirangi, Ngāti Ranginui, and Ngāti Pūkenga.
Mm-hmm.
Predominantly I've grown up most closely associated with Ngaitirangi.
Mm-hmm.
Grew up in Matapihi, which is just across the harbour there, and so that's been my closest affiliation, and my mum's affiliated to Ngāti Ranginui through Piriraka, which is at Te Puna.
Yeah.
So for any local rugby fans, with current champs at the moment, I think just throw that in there. But, so those are predominantly there, but we, as we learn more and we grow, we've got connections through to Ngāti Pūkenga and Ngā Pōtiki and through to some of the other iwi and hapu around. And I think, it is, and you might find this interesting, you can sort of edit and cut up how you want to, but I think as I've grown older, when I was a teenager or a child, and I guess coming through a generation that I didn't really know if they're Māori or were they allowed to be Māori. I really learned, hey, I've got one iwi and one waka and all that sort of thing. But as you get older, you find all these crossovers and connections and every kind of excuse to be related to somebody and connected with somebody.
Just because of how people have connected, as in mum and dads from different iwis, connecting kids then have connections down the family tree.
And even way further up the tree. So, I think society today in New Zealand is still in that you have an iwi and that must be your great and wondrous connection to being Māori, but everybody has a different experience and connection. So some people are really wedded to the iwi. Some people, it's way more hapu focused. Some people, it's just, I go to the marae, that's where all the action happens, that's where my connection happens. And then, and probably in my line of work and the different roles that I've had over the years, there's been different opportunities to actually say, well, actually, I'm also from over here, and I'm also from over there, and I'm also from over there. So, even really, if I was to sit here and tell you every iwi that I can whakapapa to, it would probably be lucky to miss anyone out.
That'd be the whole episode.
But that's the thing I like sharing with people, is that in mainstream society we sort of say you're a Māori and you're that tribe, but actually being Māori, and as you explore through whakapapa and your different genealogical links, then you start to celebrate, actually I am partially Te Arawa. As an example, I've got a meeting tomorrow with Te Arawa leaders, and it's probably going to be a bit of a prickly subject, and I'll be able to at least say, acknowledge that my mum's whānau has a link through to Ngāti Rongomai, which is one of the tribes over there in Rotorua and Te Arawa area. So at least trying to give them an inference, please don't beat me up too bad. Or sometimes they'll say, well, you need to come back and connect with us properly. And any of those things can happen, but you kind of just trust the process. So,
Do you think that that's maybe getting in the way of some proper conversations, the fact that there's a fixation on determining who people are based on their single identity rather than just the broader context.
It definitely means that if you're Māori, you have to abrogate that multiple connectivity in order to sort of get to the convenience of some of those conversations for sure. And I think it's cool for people to know everybody's grappling with that as they grow and move. I mean, my first real big experience of that was that when the legislation was going through Parliament to process returning Mauao back to iwi, I had to choose one or the other. So I couldn't.
Oh, really?
So if Waitangi was voting down there in support of this or not, it's yes or no with wherever my Waitangi whakapapa starts and ends.
Yes.
But when I did that for Waitangi, I'm not allowed to have a voice in Ngāti Ranginui.
Interesting.
And so that was a dilemma. It was I have to choose one part of my whakapapa over the other, and that's very un-Māori, you know, like for Māori you would more so acknowledge the collective whakapapa that ends up being you. So there's a legal sort of example of how that plays out, and I know some people didn't participate in that because they felt uncomfortable doing that one way or another.
Yes.
On a personal basis, I bit the bullet and chose one or the other, and made sure that just in my own interactions with people, I acknowledge the other tribes that I'm associated with. So, and there was an interesting dilemma, you know, and it's just like any other moral dilemmas you have in life. You don't know really how that's going to play out till you get to the point and go, what do? Do I say no, that's against my cultural values, or you can see that there's people trying to do the right thing and return mobile, which is awesome, and you know, it's still there as a collective icon for our community, which is kind of been a leap of faith. Some people would have said, oh no, give it back to the Māoris and they're going to close it off, and you know, I'm not going to build that fence, you know. So by and large we've enjoyed that people mainly have a good respectful interaction, and every now and then you have a Christmas when somebody from Auckland decides to come down here and release their cat on there, and somebody's got to go and find it and make sure the wildlife's okay.
Yeah, and certainly that fear factor, right, of not knowing what, and I say this in speech marks, not knowing what Māori will do.
Yeah.
Like, and which assumes a collective. Yeah. Which again is, I mean, that even is a big assumption that there is a collective Māori that we're talking about when you go down to the iwi level and then you go down to the hapu level.
Yeah.
I mean, does that even stop us talking about it properly from the outset, because there's not even one group that we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the big difficulties with the treaty is we're making assumptions on whatever people were thinking 180 odd years ago. But certainly I would never purport to speak on behalf of or for somebody from Te Tai Tokerau from up north. And yet what we can say is we know that we have a whakapapa relationship between Torua, who was the captain of the Mātātua waka and stayed here with us, and his brother Puhi, who took that same waka up there. So they're closely related, but we would never say that we could speak for them, or nor really accept that they would speak for us. So, you know, and that I can't imagine that would have changed since then to now. So yeah, it's a real difficulty because there's this big conversation happening at Waitangi with those guys, which is, you know, that's great. And support them to have a conversation and trust them to be part of that. But and of course there was a version of the treaty that came down here to Tauranga, and then whoever did or didn't sign it, and there's lots of examples about you know, renowned rangatira of Tauranga, chiefs of Tauranga, who get offered different opportunities, and some take them and some don't. And one good example that's here that sort of probably expresses where a chief might not make any assumption of having any authority over others is when Hori Tupaia here was part of the discussion is who might become the Māori king. And he turns it down, speaking something along the lines of, you know, my harbour's only shallow. I have enough food here to sustain my people, but I don't have the resources or the authority to then start to make calls over others in a wider area. So I'm just going to stick to this area where I have domain over, and I know I have that support, and I've earned that chieftainship. So, there are examples where they actively don't, say that they have any sort of authority over others. So there's all of those examples all flying around. So,
which makes it hard to come up with a plan to move forward and actually just to resolve things like how we're going to interpret the treaty, or how we're going to either put it to bed in the sense of agree the position to date and then decide what we're going to do moving forward. But it seems it would be difficult to identify what exact groups would need to be consulted, and how that would fit together in order to have an agreement that is truly between, say, Crown and Māori as a collective.
And I think what you're really grappling with here, and Joe Williams talks about it. He talks about Cook's Law versus Kupe's Law, if you've come across that seminar, I guess you'd call it. But they're two different worldviews, and one has been expected to sort of blend to the other, and of course then how do you do that the other way, and should that expectation exist, or how do you rationalise that? Because for whatever reason, Western society had a sovereign system, that did have a crown, a king or a queen at the top of it, which has been developed from centuries of development and ups, downs and whatever else, and then come to another place and almost say, well, whatever you've decided in your construct of society, however that's developed, this is our one, so you need to talk to us in that manner. And I think, the kingitanga is an attempt to do that. I think the kingitanga was where Māori saw that, Pākehā, there were advantages to having somebody that's that spokesperson or that authority at the head of it. But then even in the kingitanga, there's a certain amount of influence and I guess the ability to speak on behalf of the collective, but it does have its limitations still. So, it's always going to be difficult if one group. If I go to China and say you will speak to me in English, if the person can't speak to me in English, what do? Well, they'll probably go away and learn English, and then if I've grown up with English and they've just learnt it last week, there's going to be some difficulties with communication. And if we look at that kind of example, how do we get through it as a tourist? Well, we show and receive compassion, grace, patience, all those kinds of attributes. And they're not necessarily the attributes that grow countries, and set systems in place.
Well, and certainly not in a competitive environment where there's money and resources at stake. I mean, when you're travelling, there's a difference between kind of having a misunderstanding on the street and the stakes are so low. So, if you have a misunderstanding, you talk about it, you laugh about it, they get mad at you. Even if they get mad at you, you walk away and it doesn't really matter most of the time. And then you extrapolate that out to the treaty, and suddenly you have this document that has kind of fundamental conflicts that are really difficult to resolve. I mean, even through the 70s and 80s, there wasn't really a lot of legal, scholarly work trying to reconcile it all, trying to come up with how it all fit together to make it make sense. And we're trying to do that now a bit more, it seems. But it's kind of, you take, even, and just to use English words, you take chieftainship and sovereignty. And how do you can't reasonably reconcile the natural meaning of those two words. You have to be quite creative to make them work. And generally, that's to the detriment of the word chieftainship in the preservation of sovereignty. And to your point about the language and misunderstandings, and kind of the more you know a language, the more deeply you feel connected to certain words. And sovereignty would be one of those words, I think, for the English system.
That
there really is only one meaning to that word.
Well, and I think similarly, tino rangatiratanga at the other end. So, I've had discussions even in the last week with different people who say, but it says sovereignty, and it's like, but it also says tino rangatiratanga. And, my understanding of te reo, there is no greater authority on earth beyond that. So if you haven't given that, is that sovereignty?
So giving away kawanatanga So giving away that is subservient to tino rangatira.
Yeah, in my opinion, yes.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
And I guess the couple of things I say there is, you've got governance, and if we said it in English, governance, kawanatanga, transliteration of governor.
Yes.
Kawanatanga and governance is less than sovereignty.
Yeah, sure.
And so if you didn't know what sovereignty means, and flip it over to te reo, and you've got kawanatanga and tino rangatiratanga, and no authority is greater on earth than tino rangatiratanga, then this new word kawanatanga, that's a transliteration of governor, and you've got titles, Governor General and that sort of thing, then it'll naturally fit there. So, and of course, bearing in mind it's a new word at that time.
Yes.
And so Governor General so-and-so will go, well, I'm the Governor General, so I'm very important. Māori are probably going, well, bro, you just turned up. We like your suit, or your gear, but where does that rationally fit in? And of course, for a lot of chiefs, they would have said, well, there's nobody here that has the mana I hold, so if you need to stay here, that's all good.
And presumably it would have been very persuasive, the fact that the retention of chieftainship over my land, my people, my resources, it's that would have been what the precedent was. Yeah. That would have been the important thing. But surely there must have been an appreciation. Well, no, we're speculating about people, 200 years ago almost.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's the document doesn't make sense on the face of it, unless the British were getting that, unless the Crown was getting that in reply.
Yeah, and I think, at the end of the day too, no matter how we look at it, if we could do it all over again, I think most of my legal friends and colleagues would say, I would have tightened that.
I could have drafted something better. Yeah.
Which
I don't want to sound arrogant, but yeah. I mean,
hindsight's easy, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Easy. So, I am very much in that camp of, we can analyse each word and push it to and fro and all of those kinds of things. I really value those examples on the ground where people figure out a way to get along and figure out a way to sort of share the best of both worlds and on a more practical basis, day to day. And I had somebody who sent me a message asking about, I was surprised to hear about the 3 Ps and I've more been working through a portai model, which talks about participation and options and tino rangatiratanga and working through a different model. And I kind of said, well, either way, you still got to have a relationship of some kind. So when we come back to things like how you're sort of saying, who's the one person we could talk to or the one group we could talk to, perhaps to some degree we aren't able to bring it down to that. And rather than ask Māori in their system to come all the way to one and say whoever's the Prime Minister or whatever it might be, as more so say, well, if we can get it down from, thousands to, and that's probably where the iwi constructs have got to, is to say at least there's a series of people who, generally speaking, are pretty close to, are able to facilitate a conversation to be as inclusive as possible. That seems to...
So with some kind of... I mean, is that even leading to some kind of governance structure amongst iwi in terms of some kind of collective sub, not a sub of the Crown or a sub of New Zealand, but actually just an independent kind of collective that there could be a consolidated voice on certain points on tikanga. Yeah. So like in those real not real basics, but those fundamental points that are fundamental to Māoridom, can they be agreed and then negotiated at a high level?
So I think to some degree, and then I think it's about having that ability to also then still say, and they may or may not agree. There's still going to be that, whereas in our sort of Westminster society, it's like you're going to get there that day and there's the court session, and at the end of it somebody's going to bang a gavel and say you or you, and that's probably not where Māori always have to get to that point, because there are some really awesome forums like the Iwi Chairs Forum. It's a great forum and holds a lot of weight, and where they can resolve stuff, that's great, and it's probably just whether or not as a society we can deal with those situations where they can't deal with it. When you look at Tūranga Waiwai and the Kingitanga sort of exercising their leadership and their tools in a different way, they put that call out, but it wasn't really a let's get the who's who of whichever tribe. It was really an open discussion to run some workshops and see at the end of it whether there were things we might be able to agree to, some stuff that's still going to be parked, and some stuff we may not agree to. So, I think some of those stuff, people generally speaking are trying their best to galvanise opinion where it's possible.
Yes.
And some of these things sort of have their lives and then don't have their lives. So,
but we've talked about this kind of outside of this conversation, of that it's not necessarily the point to reach a resolution. Yeah. Whereas, like, for me, that is extremely frustrating. Yeah. Like that perspective is extremely frustrating.
Yeah.
Because this area is somewhere where, I personally would love to see some resolutions, some conclusions, some this is the way we're going to do it moving forward.
Yeah.
But that's not necessarily kind of where it can get to, potentially based on just, say, not Māori culture generally, but certainly some people in Māori.
Well, I think culturally we do have a track record of being able to let a difference of opinion be a difference of opinion, Yeah. And I think I've given you the example of, whether or not Muriwai saved the Mātātua Waka or Wairaka did, and you talk to a different tribe and they're adamant it's one or the other. Do we need, have there been fights over the years over who was right or wrong about that? Probably. But by and large, the rest of all the other tribes kind of go, well, we know that tribe's going to say it's one person, that one's going to say it's the other. And it's almost now at a point where if they don't stick to their guns on that, and are you really from that tribe, which is entertaining, but it can be frustrating as well. But I think also, in the big scheme of things too, I think the government has sold the community a bit of a story on treaty settlements.
Generally, as in over the last 40 years.
Well, even just suggesting that settlements are made, and because I think it is valuable for people to know and understand that once they've gone through the process of investigating historical breaches, on average it's 1.5% of those breaches that leave it unresolved. So, and I'm Pākehā whakapapa too, so probably that's a part of me that gets frustrated with the same things you're talking about as well. And, but sometimes I'm like, well, actually, government, you need to do better, because if I steal your car and then I give you 1% of it and go, you're good with that? I don't actually personally expect you to go, yeah, that's cool. I fundamentally think that's not actually a solution at all.
So where do you think that has gone awry in terms of the public knowing about those? I mean, certainly it's difficult to get details of treaty settlements. It's not obvious to me that that's coming from the government, that that's a joint decision of iwi and the government to keep certain details, not so secret, but certain details just to themselves or not open to public scrutiny.
Yeah. Oh, look, and maybe it's a media aspect as well. I don't know, but for whatever reason, we tend to simplify the outcome and say we just want to know that something's settled.
So saying it's settled has become more important than actually knowing the details and making sure it's fair.
Because actually, if you do go out and have a dig around, it's not actually that hard to figure out what it is. Like, if I was to say you have many millions of acres were confiscated from Waikato Tainui, and then I just chuck that into something on the internet, it's going to give me a ballpark figure of what that is. It's going to give me a ballpark, and this figure in the settlement is going to be, on average, it's 1.5% of what that quantum is. So they're so far apart that Joe Bloggs out there couldn't really say, oh, it looked all right to me. I mean, they'll hear this number over here.
Yeah.
I mean,
because the numbers are big.
Yeah. Well, and if you look at Waitangi, it's 32 million, around about. But then if you understand that Waitangi is basically the Mount Peninsula, Matakana, and over to Katikati and a few other land holdings in and about, and you stand at the Mount Hot Pools and walk up the road, you don't get that far for that same amount. So, if we're somebody flipping properties, 30 million is not a big number. Or if we're a developer, 30 million is not a big number. For our railroad worker and our road worker, and love those people, man, I appreciate roads and railroads being there for us, but in the hierarchy of things, for them that's a big number. But for my hapu, who is Tūkarangi, who goes from Mowal down to Bay Fair, I'm 1/10 of that, so that's 3 million. So, and then people go, well, you got your settlement, go back and get your land back. I was like, okay, which driveway did you want me to buy?
Yeah.
But that is still too simplistic the other way. But it makes the point that I think, Joe Bloggs out there goes, well, most of the tribes have settled, or they've settled if they are accepting of signing that 1.5% as wherever you would land, and there's a power imbalance in that. So I don't think most Kiwis would consider that a fair outcome. Now, of course, we all own properties, or we all own things, so we don't want our property to be taken. And that makes it a difficult thing, but it's always going to be difficult for 180 years later.
Yes.
So so that's what we all share, right? To say, okay, what are we going to do about that? So
one of the big argument that comes back out of that is punishing the future generations for the actions of the past.
Yeah.
And is that appropriate? Is that fair? And what does that look like?
Yeah.
And when you look at what happened after the treaty was signed, and then you look at the next 40 years after that, it's not a shining example of what we want to be in the modern world.
No. Right.
But it's certainly have to look at it in its context, but we don't want to be doing that stuff anymore.
Yeah.
So we need to be changing and doing what we want to do now.
Yeah.
And getting those settlements over the line is part of that process. But it's interesting that concept of, I reckon that's a fair statement, that Joe Blogg is more concerned about the settlement having gone through rather than what the actual details are.
Yeah.
And then it's up to the media to then determine whether the settlement was fair or not. That's kind of then drives the narrative of that broader discussion. If it's deemed that it was fair, then the headlines are that the settlement has taken place, it is great.
Yeah.
If it's deemed that it's taking too long or it's not fair, then the headlines are more sour.
Yeah, and I truly believe that society is driven by wanting to treaty settlements because we want to do the right thing. And that's why I say, to some degree, whether it's the government or media or mix of, I think just the shallowness of that means that we're being sold a bit of a story out there. I don't know about you, brother, but I feel like if I pinched anybody's car, that I wouldn't even feel like 1.5%. And whether that's 20 or 30 or 40, 50, 70, 90, every person's got a different thing. I just know most people would think 1.5's not a fair one.
Well, and here's the interesting thought experiment is that the normal remedy for someone stealing something from you is the thing back. Like as if you can choose. So you go, you stole my bike, you have my bike, because I can see it there, and the court comes along and says, well, what do you want? You say, well, I want my bike back, and then you get your bike back.
And if it's been souped up.
Yeah, exactly. And so then the value comes in secondary, is that, well, if the bike is no longer available, or they've sold the bike, or they've destroyed the bike, that's when the valuation of the bike comes in to determine then what the fair compensation is going to be.
And the impact on the person who may have received their bike, no matter how many transactions, is summarised in the statement, buyer beware.
Yes.
So it's a really difficult thing to rationalise in a legal sense because of how we've set up our structures, but when it comes to my land, it's not that. And interestingly enough, I don't meet many Awhini Māori who say, oh no, Simon's got a property down there that went through that. I don't see people saying, actually, we want you to just be booted out of your house and take it. And I have heard people say to me, oh, we'll give you the land, but you're not having a house on top of it. I'm like, where will you sign on that dotted line? But people aren't actually seriously, and they're not in that kind of zone.
Well, the problem arises around the time delay.
Yeah.
Because that same bike example, 100 years later, my great-great-great-grandchildren aren't entitled to anything from your great-great-great-grandchildren just because you stole my bike.
Yeah.
The hard thing and that makes sense logically, but then you have the crown is never ending.
Yeah.
So then the crown itself, the state itself, it's not the state. Like the state back then did it, but it kind of carries on. But certainly the further you get from an event, the more likely it is that it's hard for people to appreciate that there should be compensation.
Well, and the other difficulty in the example is land, because the land is still there. So, where it's a bike, it may or may not still be there.
Yes.
Unfortunately, and the part of the complexity
as
of
in
it
the
is
original
that the land
remedy technically is still available.
Yeah, it's still available.
Yeah.
And that's why I like that a lot of people, you got to love and hate humans, Like humans go, I don't actually want to take this off Simon, but equally is Simon or any other generations through there saying, oh, can you please just forget about it? And that's the part that I think, New Zealand has as a challenge in front of us, is that te whenua aren't going to forget about it either. So it's too, land is too much of a cornerstone in our society, and the way that wealth and affluence and a thriving family and productivity is all hinged all around it.
Yes.
That's too big a burden to ask of people as well. But there are some innovative things that pop out of kids and people who have been sort of on the sidelines, maybe don't have a law degree or a business or anything, often pop up with different things and say, well, what if we did just get all of the parks and return those parts of it? And then I've seen people get into discussions where they say, let's talk about the mountains. Say, well, what if those parks came back? And funnily enough, sometimes there's some golf courses which are technically reserves and parks and that people find hard to let go, but actually they're a public piece of land, and then people will say, oh, where are we going to do our recreation? Well, there's all this beach that's all still public. And so it gets quite, you sort of wave your way through and sort of figure out. And I've sort of seen people have really healthy conversations around that without getting to an answer.
Yes.
So I find that part of human nature quite interesting and quite encouraging, that people are like, okay, what else could we do? Because I think also what happens is that the Crown has limited what it would even put up as options.
The asset pool law.
Yeah, well, and different ways to cut that. I think I can't remember if it was you or someone else I was telling about, the situation that did happen up north where there was a farmer that invoked a change of law whereby private land is no longer subject to treaty claims, and it was 10 years or so later that actually all of his storyline that sparked off that legislative change in Parliament was actually his own criminal doing, but he got found out, but the law remained and had changed. And I mean, in the big scheme of things, is that positive or negative? The outcome is probably worth a debate, because it's probably helpful to Kiwis that it's around public land is available for treaty settlements, not private. But the way that we got there is a fundamental flaw, I think, for the legal system to deal with. And I say that being a law graduate too, but the trigger that made us do the law change, which you would hope is espoused in doing the right thing or in righteousness in some way, is proven to be wrong. And that's the catalyst for the change.
Yes.
It kind of undermines
and
process.
Often difficult. There's a famous kind of, and it's not a saying per se, but it's difficult cases make bad law, is a common colloquialism. That's the word I'm looking for.
Yeah.
And so when the facts are tricky, then the court is trying to put a square peg in a round hole, and then it doesn't necessarily make the best law. And you see that through court cases, but you also see it through legislation as well. So difficult situations and trying times create significant obligations for legislation or obligations for action. And so much of governance is just kind of going with the flow and just slowly pushing things and getting down the road. But then you have big trigger events, and there's a need for significant legislation, and it doesn't turn around. It's like prices going up during inflation. They don't go back down to what they were before.
Great example.
So once the law's in, it's much more difficult to get law out, and particularly now with the way that we're governed with MMP and generally coalition governments. It is more difficult for law to get in and out as a general principle, would be my presumption, not having lived through the 70s, 80s, 90s. That's just kind of how I would look at it.
Well, it makes sense, and I mean, and by and large, I think in most situations it serves us okay.
It's these kind of bounce.
Yeah, it's these outliers, where there's some injustice that's happened, and I still think people in the chain of events are trying to do the right thing. I mean, in that example, nobody wants to see anybody's house have an argument and have a fight on the front lawn. But don't burn a man's house down, and or in a person and that kind of thing. Have a fight. First to bleed loses. We'll bring that rule back, and we might be all right. I'm not saying that.
We say jokingly, yeah.
Which is because you'll already be able to beat me up.
Yeah. And because this is where we're at now, is that we've got the treaty. Clearly, we've had to interpret it to move forward together. Both if you assume that there's a partnership between the Crown and Māori, or if you assume that there's a contractual relationship between two parties with consideration going both ways, or if you try and argue that the treaty doesn't exist. There's still the principles that have come out of that relationship. And that's where that seems to be where we've transitioned to, and that's potentially the road forward, is to focus on that relationship. Focus on how to enshrine those principles, then use that as the basis moving forward.
Look, I believe so. I mean, I think, and I don't envy the job of lawyers in the courts where you get to a point where you have to make a call one way or the other.
I agree.
And I think that difficulty may or may not ever be resolved. But as a society, the more comfortable we get with conversations wherever they may go, and acknowledging the rights and wrongs, because there's plenty of Māori who were deceitful over the years, or who did sign something knowing they couldn't sign something, and all of the whole rest of that. This is really complex. There's no good and bad guy or anything. There's all sorts of motivations. Somebody's trying to get ahead in life, whichever way they get presented with opportunities. We all get temptations in our lives, and you've got to rationalise that one way or another. But in the everyday society stuff, that's where we have the opportunity. And people ask me about, for example, at council. I mean, we've got a bunch of different arrangements that, by and large, have moved mainly towards, if we have Māori at the table, then they're included in the process and the decision making, and we acknowledge that they often will come from a different perspective that the rest of the table wouldn't consider. And I often joke and say, maybe if there were Māori at the decision making table when the industrial zone got pushed to Whareroa, somebody would have said, hey, there's a marae there. You'd hope that the rest of the team saw it, but let's assume they didn't for whatever reason. Having that other voice there would have just raised that and said, well, maybe we don't need to go that far, because the truth is, if back then a decision was made, let's say 70 or 100 metres less than what it is, we'd probably be in a pretty balanced situation now.
Yeah, sure.
Funnily enough, there's some of our, without a whole lot of fanfare, there's some committees at council that actually tangata whenua outnumber the commissioners.
Yeah, right.
But what happens at those tables is that everybody has good, strong governance happening there, whereby here's the issue, here's the information around the issue, everybody give their perspective on it to try and land at the best decision. And I can't think of any situations where they haven't decided on things unanimously. Because if the city needs a car park, the city needs a car park. You can cut that every which way, and you can make a better call as to where that might be and whatever else that it might be. And none of those decisions are perfect. But actually, by and large, there's not that much disagreement that actually happens there. I think jokingly, if the commissioners watch this, I know I've said this to them, is I think the only thing they've actually not been able to do unanimously was the local alcohol policy. So, in other words, what time our bars shut and that sort of thing. And I know they've grappled with that too and returned to the table to discuss that. And I think that's good governance, because you're having that discussion all the time, and you never make any presumptions as to what that outcome is. So, in the day-to-day stuff, I've certainly seen a ton of success where people just slow down a little and take a little bit of time to understand where each other's coming from, and they tend to go, cool, well, I can understand that, and where's that middle ground that we need to work out. And it's always going to be a bit prickly in there, but I back Kiwis to be able to come up with something, because by and large we've done pretty well.
Yeah.
But I find that interesting.
It comes up against the presumption that that there needs to be space for Māori at the table, and whether it should be reserved for Māori or whether it should just be through either competence, as in working up in council, or et cetera, or through election.
Yeah, and I guess in the local government context, you do have an obligation in there to maintain and improve contribution at the decision-making table. So you've got to decide what does that mean. And I've seen different people do it in different ways too. You know, I've seen some councillors, commissioners, and managers, make a real effort to go out and learn about different things. But even looking at the start of this conversation, we're having a conversation about where do iwi, hapu, marae and whānau fit into that social construct. I'm sharing with you what I know in my 47 years. But I would acknowledge that I'm grappling with that and figuring that out as well. So, it is a tough gig to have a councillor, especially if they're a councillor or sometimes a whole group of councillors where nobody's been to a marae. Nobody is interacting in that Māori world to understand and see how that goes. And Whare was a good example. I'll also say, when those decisions were made, they're at funny times, in our society. And I might have shared with you, there's a monument in Waikato to the soon-to-be extinct Māori race. And not a derogatory thing, but just that was a farmer who admired the Māori race but felt like they are going to be extinct soon in the 50s, and so
because that was the let's say prediction, right? There was a time in our history where that's where we thought it was heading.
And so I start to put myself into the decision maker's shoes of that day, and I think, well, it's not without logic, is what I'm trying to say. That maybe they had a discussion in the council chambers and said, yes, we've extended this industrial zone. It's not industrial right now. The marae is there, but that trend is going towards that might not be there.
Yes.
And so we get to today's day and age, and lo and behold, they are there. So despite the history, I enjoy trying to facilitate a conversation where we say, yep, we'll acknowledge all the different things, but today we are where we are. What are we going to do? And I do find that there's discussions you can have that are about the right thing to do, and then there's discussions you can have about as long as it doesn't cost whoever.
Yeah.
And that's that. This taints the discussion.
Yes.
Because there's going to be a cost somewhere, but there's also been a benefit. So let's say that industrial zone was changed in the 50s, then you've had 70 years of commercial economic benefit, however you want to put it. Now for someone to say, but if we change that zoning, it's going to change the value of my property. Well, let's have a good look at that and just see how much you've made and what difference it did make and what you purchased for, because it's probably still up. It's just not up.
Well, and it's micro versus macro.
Yeah.
It's the same thing as the argument that we shouldn't put restrictions, or we shouldn't drive interest rates up because first-time buyers are going to be negatively impacted who have bought, or buyers who have bought in the last year, not just first-time buyers, but anyone, that their house value is going to go down. But if you extrapolate it back out 3 years, then suddenly everyone's still up. And if you extrapolate it back 10 years, everyone's still well up.
Yeah.
So the question is not about whether there's a negative impact. The question is whether the negative impact at the more micro level is worth the macro importance of that decision.
Yeah.
And it's
I'm going to pinch that micro macro.
Yeah, you go.
That's good.
And it's tricky because like individuals, which is we're so focused on the individual, are impacted negatively every day by decisions. So if we govern based on what individuals are getting outcomes on, then it's a struggle to keep everyone happy. Like, not everyone's going to be happy. Yeah. I work in an office of 20 people. Yeah. Not every day, not everyone is happy every single day. So I mean, it's over a population of whatever we are now, 4 million or whatever it is. Then you're going to have unhappy people. Yeah. But how to move forward as much together as possible, that seems to be the challenge.
Yeah.
Do you reckon that we can get? I mean, there's been a lot of kind of publicity around the bill that's going to be proposed for the principles of the treaty, and there's some suggestions that it may not be focused on enshrining the principles of the treaty as we know them to date, like what the courts have been developing. Yeah. But do you think that that's something that we could get to, or that would be helpful?
Well, what I find probably the most interesting is that one party to a contract can relitigate the contract.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I've been marinating on that the last few days.
Yeah.
That, you've got the Crown, and within the Crown you have the three branches, and the courts being one of that.
Yeah.
And the courts is where the principles have been developed to interpret the arrangement. And then you've got the government, who are then wanting to drive legislation through Parliament, another branch of the Crown.
Yeah.
And it's all, as you say, it's all on that one side of the ledger, kind of determining what the interpretation should be.
Yeah.
But we don't really, what choice do we have? That's where we're at now, right?
Well, it's entertaining for Māori, because really Māori here with the popcorn going, can you three on your side of the table work out if you're going to beat each other up or not, And
yeah, sure.
there's a reaction that happens with the likes of Tūranga Waiwai, but man, it was such a positive point. Let's go and have workshops and just say, what can we do, not what can't we do. It's just a whole different dynamic. And
yes,
sometimes I feel proud as Māori to say that's actually what we can offer society, is that as much as we have, and you have a government that has and it's debatable over the years as to how much of this arm's length that the judiciary has from government. But the theory of it's good, is to have some independence, to have the fairness aspect come through in that. But, it's moments like these that Māori kind of go, how's the system go for you guys, And but the hui that was held is so positive, it's those MPs that attended, by and large, from what I've seen, got a lot of value for being there and listening and seeing part of it. But they're just two big differences in the world, right?
Yeah.
So I think for me, I have gone, it's interesting that, one side of the, and it just demonstrates really the ongoing massive power imbalance that happens. And the treaty settlements are 1.5%, because at the end of the day, what's Māori going to do? They're going to negotiate, and then different pressures come from wherever, and then you have governments here, pressures from voters to say settle something, but don't put the budget up and taxes up. So all these things are all forces that are pushing on the outcome. But I find the most interesting with the bill stuff is that the government seems to be, and I don't know enough to say it has the audacity to, but seems to be going, we're going to relitigate this and we're going to tell you what's up. And I know I've talked to a couple of people who I really enjoy talking to and respect, who said, but you have Māori representation at Parliament. And I go, well, it's really convenient to have this discussion when they're 5 out of 120. Because would you have had the discussion when it was
80,000 to 2,000?
Yeah, the other way around.
Yeah,
and,
sure.
And, I don't think we actually have to answer that, but it's just so that let's not let that be the measure of how good we're doing our collective work,
So does that, that to me makes these conversations more important.
Yeah.
In terms of taking control back as the people, and what that looks like and what we want to see moving forward. I guess one of the reactions I have in that space is when we talk, I talk about whether it's with a councillor, a commissioner, an MP, a business person, a neighbour, whoever it is, we tend to figure it out. Kiwis have got a proud history of working it out. And when we allow ourselves space to do that, I've seen so many examples of people teaching each other new things and gaining understanding and working out solutions and by and large things that are fair and find their way to that. So I am a big fan of backing Kiwis to have those conversations and so to some degree, having whether it be government or judiciary or whoever go too far down the this is how we shall define and do this every day is a little bit like saying, well, I'm going to marry my missus as long as she's exactly like she is today on this wedding day. And she might say the same thing back to me and I might lose faster than she loses. But the point being is that things are going to evolve and change. A relationship means you're going to interact and talk and work things out and all those kinds of things. And we're going to get grey hairs. And we're going to get a bit more of a puku at some stage or slow down or whatever it might be. That's okay. We've got to adapt and go, okay, when I first married you, we went for a run every day.
and now we might go for a walk. It's actually not that big a difference, but it is actually a crucial difference between whether you're going to stay together or not, because if you carry on having a run and somebody can't do it, you leave them behind.
Well, and this is the distinction I would make between, say, terms and principles. Would be that the term would be we're going to run every day. The principle would be that we're going to care about our bodies and do what we need to do to look after ourselves.
Yeah.
And I guess that's where I reckon there needs to be some development of making sure that we're all in agreement of what those principles are. Because if we all agree we should look after ourselves, how we do that. Now that's the part that there has to be flexibility on the how.
And I think, it's not being afraid to say, because we kind of do this already, right? We might set a policy, but we have a review date on the policy. That's good practice. Because whatever we figured out on that day, we might know some other day.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you're letting swear words on the podcast.
Yeah.
Hopefully it's not too.
There'll be a little duck sound or something.
Yeah, there you go. That'll be better. But, that we actually, and I say this to Packers have great thinking that should be shared as well. And often when somebody said to me, a rising tide lifts all boats, I'm like, another great Pākehā whakatauki.
Yeah.
Pākehās have whakataukis too, man. Like, don't be afraid of those. But, policy, you set a policy and then you say, we're going to review it in a sensible time, it's about 3 years. So really what we're saying is, we might set them because some people want to have some
certainty
of it. Yeah. But the reality is we're actually not setting them. That's just what we figured out that day. For the person who's more fluid, he wants to know we're going to be able to revisit this and fine tune it and get it right and work out that when we first got together, we needed a car. Then at one point in our life, we needed to move to a van because we've got heaps of kids.
Yeah,
it makes sense. It's all good.
Yeah, and I guess that comes back to that fundamental problem which we talked about at the start of this conversation, which is that you can only really reach agreement on what that looks like when you have two groups or you have a closed group of parties that are then all agreeing.
Yeah.
But when you don't have that, which is kind of that's what it is in New Zealand, in difference of opinions, and you have some leaders in the Māori world standing up and saying that there won't be any discussion of the future until the past grievances are dealt with.
Yeah.
And that to me is a very difficult position to kind of take, because we're moving forward by definition.
Yeah.
So we can't be only dealing with the past. We have to deal with the future, because otherwise we're just going to get more and more grievances, and there's always going to be then a train of grievances.
And it's the nature of the complexity of what we have in front of us. It's just too simplistic to say one polarized view or the other. So we've got to rationalize and work our way through some of that stuff. I guess where I see it getting oversimplified is where the Crown wants that one body. And, we talked earlier on about the Iwi Chairs Forum. It's a good forum, it can cover a lot of ground. It's just that it can't cover all the ground. And like in our mainstream society, it's kind of the Crown's allocated the authority to cover all the ground, and it's a difference in the cultures. So, but it's not that hard, it's actually working all right around us all the time. Like, there's a certain level of conversation you can have at that level, but there's value in having close relationships within a region or a city with an iwi nearby, and competition and jealousy sometimes at the right level is a healthy thing. And I look at some of our iwi around the country who have really made a lot of strides in housing or in health or whatever it might be. So, but that's the position and the leadership they have that allow and feed that fire and let it glow. And then, but in another region, it's going to be something a little bit different. So, I don't know. If we take away some of the noise, a lot of the time, I'm not sure we're that far off getting it right. And it's almost like we don't want to get it entirely right, because otherwise we won't have a chat. Yeah. So, are we that far off it with, where we're going? And there's room for improvement, of course, but by and large, when we have everybody together, is really cool.
Well, and the big political football at the moment is the co-governance side of it, and how that fits into the principles and how Māori should be integrated into governance, and that's a rubber hits the road kind of issue. That we have to have some degree of agreement as to how it all fits together. And of course, now we've seen under the previous government, co-governance models that were being rolled out, and now we're going to see those rolled back under the current government.
Yeah.
And then who knows what we'll see in 3 years' time.
Well, that's why I say what I enjoy with Tauranga City Council is that over the years, with different circumstances in each place we've had those conversations, there's actually a range of all of those things all happening right there, and I'm not a fan of the term co-governance. I think it is just too prescriptive. It's co and then governance. It just suggests 4 and 4, and then you get brought into the 4 versus 4, and here's a set of golf clubs. Now it's 5 versus 3. Yay, we won. It's really an awkward way to run a society. There's going to be times when you do need to vote, but surely most things we're actually like, yes, we need to improve the traffic flow along Hewlett's Road. Anybody disagree with that? No? Okay, so what are we going to do about it, So co-governance seems to infer quite an adversarial sort of setup.
As in, these are the two parties that are co-governing together, and
you start getting
be
into
in conflict with each other.
And you get into numbers, and it's a numbers game and all that sort of thing. I mean, the stuff that we've been doing at TCC is that, for each of the committees when I first arrived, we just said, let's just have a tangata whenua person at the table. Now, it's a bit of an indictment on us as humans that once we agreed we should have a tangata whenua voice at the table to say, let's bring that perspective, and we saw heaps of examples where they bring something. We never thought about that. Many heads are better than one, another great Pākehā whakatauki. But, the more difficult part was that it took us ages to figure out we should actually give them a vote and respect their input into the table and remunerate the same as everybody else does. For whatever reason, that part seems to be the harder part. That I would have thought comes part and parcel with it, but for whatever reason. So then you had people at the start that had 10 or 11 in the committee and one Māori voice, and I remember talking to councillors who were concerned about that, and I go, well, the democratic process means you're going to have a vote. So there's no threat there. What you're doing is affording the respect of having that other perspective at the table. So that was sort of the early start, but we've got examples that cross over all of them. I mean, the one committee that the commissioners rely on has four commissioners and 3 tangata whenua members there. And not by a co-governance, this, that, or whatever, is what they figured is that when the councillors were sort of relieved of their duties for the commissioners to do their part, they grabbed the tangata whenua reps and said, well, you can create some consistency, but your job is to be a good governor. And they've taken that up. So that's been interesting.
So more seeing
it's representation and a voice, and if I come back to tino rangatiratanga, that's what I would imagine it is. I need some way that I can determine for myself whether, that I can have a voice into there and have a say in there. So that's what I like in the relationship of representation and tino rangatiratanga, is the ability that tino rangatiratanga means I have chieftainship over myself and those who give me authority to have that over them. But I love you, bro, but you're probably not going to have that go from our hapu because you've got too much to learn about what our priorities would be. So my best thing I can do to help you is be there alongside you.
So the model is, and this is where this tino rangatiratanga for all, which is this a new. I've never heard this until like a week ago. This idea of that tino rangatiratanga for Māori and for non-Māori, but that's kind of what you're describing in terms of that representation at the governance level is important for Māori as the same it is for non-Māori. Well, and then having representation at the table to be able to discuss this stuff around and then govern all.
Yeah,
rather than be divided up into different groups that are governed this way and governed that way.
And I just see it play out that way time and time again. You still got to call out bad behaviour like you would at any board. Yes. Somebody turns up and says, I think we should go and purchase this business, and it turns out they're the person selling their own business. Somebody else has to go, well, Carlo, we're not buying your business because you're here making the decision. You've got to call those out. And people sort of pretend that stuff doesn't happen. It happens all the time. People are testing these boundaries all the time. It's just good governance.
And that's why we have regulations, right?
Yeah.
Because that's why we have a building code. If everyone built great houses by choice, we wouldn't need a building code.
Yeah.
Because there would be no one trying to go down to the minimum standards. So that's why we have minimum standards across the board, and you extrapolate that out over everything. It's why we have speed limits. It's why we have this.
Totally. And it's why, in Aotearoa, we are better off together. Like, bring the ideas about two different cultures. It's when one gets squashed out that things get a bit heated, I think.
Do you think that's getting harder the more multicultural New Zealand becomes? So the more we have from the islands, the more we have from Asia, the more we have from Europe.
Well, I think we kind of got to resolve the first stuff. I think the treaty does mean there is this disagreement that pitches those people out there. I can only speak to conversations I've been involved in, but I certainly often see that if there is any other culture that is in and around somewhere that tangata whenua have influence on, by and large, they get included and kind of brought in under a wing anyway, and if there's an opportunity to be there side by side. So I've seen lots of examples where tangata whenua will say, well, I can't speak for our Pacifica whānau, let me ask them. It's just a natural thing that seems to happen in that space, and a lot of Pākehā do that too. But for whatever reason, over the years, governments have tended to kind of grab that power and construct a society that says, oh, well, tough luck, and that's why the whole tino rangatiratanga for all kind of thing, I find it quite entertaining. I'm like, do our Pākehā whānau, myself included with my Pākehā whakapapa, I think I cheekily put it to you in the intro.
Yeah.
As, we haven't been excluded. We've always had tino rangatiratanga as Pākehā. So when they say tino rangatiratanga, well, a lot of the time in those examples I just gave, you're giving up one seat, usually adding one, not even giving up an existing seat, to make sure that an area is covered that we really most often agree people don't have a great understanding of. So why give them that burden? But that's a lot different from you're taking my power kind of scenario, or I need to protect my power. Well, there's still blinking 9 over here and 1 over there.
Which is, and we talked about this previously, which is the whole we're not half together. Like, we're not half of each other together.
Yeah.
Where we can actually be whole together and therefore be more together.
Yeah.
Which is a different perspective rather than looking at the power struggle of it, which is easy to get into and difficult to reconcile.
Yeah.
Like, it's difficult when you have these structures set up and then you have votes and you have, anytime someone comes in and the word veto gets thrown around, that's like throwing a stick of dynamite into the middle of people. Everyone freaks out.
And it's natural. It's natural.
And that's how, I don't think there is a right answer that's been postulated or told yet as to how to handle that side of it and how to have true what the relationship should look like, what the balance should look like.
And that's why I say there's always still got to be responsibility on every person to be doing good governance, if that's what you're doing, or to be, good decision making, or acting in good faith at all times. And it should be healthy boards call it out amongst each other, because they're playing the ball, not the man. If I see Simon do something, I assume you're a good dude. You did that by mistake, but I've got to call that out. Otherwise, that's just going to grow and fester and become the norm.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, for whatever reason, some of our governance structures over the years, they've proven that things like that happen, and people start feathering their own nest, because you've got to really resist human nature on that part of it. And that includes in Māori government. There's nothing more public than an iwi that makes a bad investment. Investment by nature is going to have something that's not going to work out, But again, if we take all the drama out of it and say, well, we're trying to give feedback or contribute to get a better outcome, that generally drives good outcomes. So as I say, in that representation model, where it might be tino rangatiratanga is preserved by saying, come into the room to help make whatever decision it is, it's still incumbent on that person to act in good integrity and in good faith and honesty. And we talk
good
about
faith's the big one.
Yeah.
That encapsulates all of that. You can talk about honour, respect, fiduciary obligations. But good faith seems to be the catch-all, and we use it a lot. I use it a lot every day.
Yeah.
Where it's it's have parties acted in good faith? Have they done the things that they know, even if the words don't back them up, that they know was what was agreed? And it's horrible. And I advise people all the time: if it's what you signed, I know it's not saying what you thought it says, but you did sign it. So if we're going to run this argument that there's some other meaning to these words that's not the ordinary meaning on the page, we're pushing it uphill a little bit.
Yeah,
starting from a bad position, but you overlay the good faith obligation. So if you know that I didn't mean 10,000, I meant 1,000.
Yeah,
and I always meant 1,000 and never would have paid 10,000. Yeah, that's when that broader obligation kicks in.
And to be honest, if you look into society, and I crack up about this all the time, with people in high power positions that I end up having to yarn to. Okay, to be honest, the problems, like the things that come across your desk, will be a fraction of what happens out there. I've seen a ton of things where, somebody's supposed to pay, $20 and hands over more, and the person goes, "No, you've given me too much." We've got this. In society, we've got this. This is all good. The prickly end, and I guess part of the podcast here with you is around how does the legal fraternity, you get the prickly end, you get the pointy end of the stick. So how do you rationalise your part of it? I think it is a strong and powerful message to our society to say, by and large, we actually do really good.
Yes.
Like how the All Blacks don't worry about what colour you are, and then they're all going to do the haka. And you go and tell one of the All Blacks, the Pākehā boys, they're not allowed to do the haka, they're going to be just as upset as everybody else.
Yes.
Are we worried about? I'm sure if somebody went and played, one language of the national anthem, people would go, "Yeah, and he played half of it."
Where's the other half? Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
So those, I talk to my Pākehā mates that they get cheeky to me, and I say, "Well, when you were overseas last and you had too many beers, what did you do?" Because I bet you did a haka. But that's cool. Like, good. Yeah. Enjoy that and do that in good faith. If you went there because you're proud and you did it, then me.
Yeah, exactly.
If you went there and you were being a dick, or you're trying to give some commercial benefit over something that you can't say is yours alone,
or you were deliberately taking the mickey.
Yeah, then that's a problem. And by and large, again, we deal with that.
Well, and it's something that, like, growing up, I don't know what you think of this, but like growing up, appropriation of culture didn't really exist when it came to Māori. I did kapa haka in high school. Yeah. I was never accused of that I was somehow appropriating Māori culture and that shouldn't be doing that, and that was a bad thing. If anything, it was the opposite. Yeah. It was great, that integration of culture. Yeah. And that, to me, is one of the biggest strengths that we should be amplifying in New Zealand. Is actually that there is no such thing as appropriation of Māori culture in New Zealand. If we want to grow tikanga, we want to grow engagement with the language. Then it has to be open to everyone, right?
And there's that fine line, right? So utilising it and expressing yourself, yes. Commercialising, maybe a different discussion. And it's it's
difficult to navigate that.
Yeah, totally. And it exists now. Even with the haka that we just talked about with the All Blacks, right? That's not Tauranga's haka.
No.
Kamate is not Tauranga's haka, and in fact, we would acknowledge Ngāti Toa and Te Rauparaha and the origins. We know the story behind it. We're proud that that's the one that's been chosen for the All Blacks to do for whatever reason and all that sort of thing. But, have that discussion with Ngāti Toa about being fair about that. If being from Tauranga, if I go somewhere and if I'm going to do something, and there'll be people probably watching going, "Well, Carlo doesn't do haka very often," which is true. But if I did, it would be Manganui, which is our anthem haka for here. So there is all of those parts. But that's right. I actually want people to say tauranga and be proud of tauranga, because they know that what tauranga means is a safe anchorage for all. Which also means those of us who might be tangata whenua here, by and large, in good faith, if Simon turns up here, we want him to be safe and thrive and do well. We want him to have a good business that's doing good mahi out there and by and large be successful. That's also about being tauranga, and so you got to carry that meaning and live up to it. But when people are in te aronga, it's a little bit less inspiring. So if we can share, go tauranga and know what tauranga is about. Otu Muay Thai is an interesting one here in Tauranga because it's a difficult word, right?
It is.
But yet all of our ancestors, Pākehā, Māori, whatever, it got through. It made its way through to here.
Yes.
So all of those people, despite all the sort of language barriers and whatever else was happening at the time, they all, Otu Muay Thai College, one of the main colleges, has still got quite a complex name. But then when you talk to people and say, what does Otu Muay Thai mean? And of course you can go, a tide standing still like it's asleep, or it's sort of literal.
Yes.
But if you actually come into town on a cold winter's morning and you might be coming in fairly early and you got a big day ahead and you look at the sea and it's just flat and glassy, not a breath of wind, that's Otu Muay Thai. And by and large, for people who live in Tauranga, whether they've come from Auckland or Pākehā or Māori or whatever, it's one of those times that we go, I'm just really grateful to live here because that's a really calming environment and a nurturing environment to be around. So Otu Muay Thai, when you know the story behind it, it kind of makes you want to say Otu Muay Thai and not oats or airemaira.
Yeah.
But without the story, you don't have really anything to hinge on to, so it doesn't really make you do, I go to oats.
Well, and I would actually be tentatively more critical that we don't say, if you said champagne, that's not champagne.
Yeah.
If you said CAO, that's not chow.
Yeah.
These are difficult words that are not phonetic.
Yeah.
If we spoke them phonetically, then we would say them weird.
Yeah.
But we choose to respect the culture that they're from by pronouncing them properly.
Especially when you're going to get some of that champagne.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, there's an element of that too, of that, maybe a little bit more effort in Te Reo and it would be good for everyone.
Don't get me started on how fluent people become in Thai all of a sudden when they're on their way over there.
on their way to their honeymoon.
That's mean.
Yeah.
It's actually good practice, and sometimes as Kiwis, because of the noise around us, we just forget to do that, man.
Well, and I think also you forget how important it is to people, their language.
Yeah.
Because I'm half Hungarian, so when I've been back to Hungary, I don't pretend to speak a lot of Hungarian, but when I go back, I make sure I brush up.
Yep.
And I've only been back once, and I will again when I go back. But there's certain words and certain sounds in Hungarian.
Yep.
And they're not like any other kind of English, certainly not like English. Yep. If you try and speak the language and you use those sounds correctly, the locals love it.
Anybody's been
My
to
people
France?
love it. Yeah.
France, you get the same thing.
Right? And so that it's such a immediate gateway to kinship. It's an immediate gateway to you're not me and you're not like me, but you are trying to respect who I am, and language is so much a part of what we do.
100%.
So once you get through that, then suddenly it's that whole tourist on the sidewalk not understanding debacle. It's that as long as you're both trying, then generally it's a good interaction.
Well, it creates good faith. They can see you're acting
Creates
in good faith.
Yeah.
So no, exactly. I mean, there's a million examples in and around that, and I do the Thai is one that I use, and I say, when you've been to Hawaii, everyone says aloha, and it probably should be aloha, but anyway, aloha. But they're just proud of it. When you go to Fiji, Pākehā Fijian people say bula.
Bula vanaka.
All day long, and we love it. And then we go over there, and we all yelling out bula everywhere,
Yes.
Take away all the hang-ups and all the worries. For us as Kiwis, and I think I said this to you one time as well, but definitely to many others, as I said, understanding our past and how that treaty documented and the transgressions that happen after it, that's for us to understand, not to carry and be guilty about. And that's why I like that discussion around, I don't believe that Kiwis would feel like treaty transgressions would be resolved by 1.5%. In the same way that I don't think that you would say, well, it's my fault that Tauranga got confiscated in my offices here. That's not your fault in any way. But equally, whoever needs to resolve that, do it to a fair level some way or another. Try and get close to it one way or another. Back us to be innovative and clever and work that through somehow or another. but don't leave us, short and insult our intelligence and say, "Oh, it's all sorted out." Well, I'll not be so sorted out.
Well, and this creates a long-term problem, Carlo, around how to close that chapter in our history.
Unresolved one.
Yeah.
But I think, the first step is saying, well, whoever's telling us that it's sorted out, let's not believe that. Let's keep our conversations going on this. And you do also win things day to day. Winning back trust and confidence takes time and repetition as well, both ways. And I kind of enjoy seeing our society work through that as well. And sure, there's plenty of examples where people get polarized, but as I say, by and large, there's so many good people. I mean, for those on your podcast, this is the second time I've ever spoken to you.
Yeah.
And I enjoy the challenges you put back and the insights you're giving us, and I think they make us a better place. And now our mutual friend Kelsey Taratuas, who you would have had some chats with, I was just with him this morning, and I mean, that's a man I could talk to about solutions and complex situations, seemingly unendingly, but there's plenty of people out there that are thinking hard and working through things and day to day doing the right thing each and every day, and saying, hey, I can give a bit of grace here, and hopefully we're meeting in the middle somehow. And every now and then you get a bite where somebody says, you're off, but more often than not, you figure something out and announce that, and just learning about each other. That you're Hungarian. That's awesome. And when I meet somebody who's Hungarian one day, I'm going to go, oh, my other cousin's Hungarian, because Māoris make cousins with everybody. That's what we do. And but humans do that too.
Yes, and it's that desire it is that fundamental desire to find common ground. I think.
Yeah.
Like I think that, and as Kiwis, we generally do that.
Yeah.
On a day-to-day basis. It's just then extrapolating it out. Yeah. I reckon that's a really nice place to close off the conversation for this evening.
Awesome, mate.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for sitting down with me. And no doubt it might be the only conversation that we have to the public about this stuff, but hopefully it won't be the last conversation that anyone has about this stuff.
No doubt.
Yeah, good.